Welcome back, Minifans. In this week's installment of You Make Me Sick, we're going to explore a few examples of how Kirk was right when it comes to some of his personal views with regard to bare feet and his avoidance of swimming in lakes and ponds. So you may be asking, are these proclivities of Kirk rational? Is this part of his OCD, or is he just being a bit reactionary? Well, I think you see by the end of this episode that Kirk was right when it comes to all of these viewpoints. To start, let's talk about feet, and more specifically bare feet. We all know how much Kirk hates bare feet. So we ask the question, is Kirk right? So you may say that going barefoot really can't be bad for you, right? After all, the earliest record of any kind of shoe is from 9,000 years ago. Humans have been around for much, much longer than that. We survived all of that time as a species without shoes. So could being barefoot actually be that bad? Is there really anything that you can encounter with bare feet that can make you sick? Well, the answer to that is yes. First, we're going to start by stating the obvious. If walking barefoot, or even with open-toed shoes, the risk of obtaining a cut, an abrasion, some other injury that can cause the skin to be open and exposed is increased. By taking this risk, you're susceptible to any number of pathogens that can cause minor irritation to severe illness, and in some cases even death. Example number 1, tetanus. Even with shoes on, you can run the risk of stepping on a rusty nail, some other sharp object, a piece of glass, something that can pierce the skin, right? Now without shoes, this risk is exponentially increased. So what is tetanus? Tetanus is a potentially fatal disease that's characterized by an increase in rigidity of the muscles and convulsive spasms. Tetanus is caused by a spore-forming bacteria called Clostridium tetani. The spores of this bacteria, which are found in soil which is contaminated with animal and human feces, which makes them accessible to pretty much anything or anyone walking on contaminated ground. If you're barefoot, the risk of coming in contact with this bacteria obviously increases. So how do the spores get in? Well, the spores can enter the body through breaks in the skin. Any kind of a puncture wound, wounds with a significant amount of tissue loss or tissue injury. Obviously, these are things that can happen barefoot even when you're not paying attention, especially if you're on rough terrain. So tetanus itself, right? Why is it so dangerous? So the reason that tetanus is so dangerous is it actually produces a potent toxin. It's called tetanospasmin. Right? Great name for something that causes your muscles to spasm, huh? So, as the toxin itself is absorbed into the bloodstream and the lymphatic system, it spreads throughout the body, and it eventually enters the nervous system. Once in the nervous system, this is where it causes painful and often violent muscular contractions. One of the typical first symptoms, and a hallmark of this, is actually the condition called lockjaw. This is obviously when the jaw ends up seizing up due to the amount of toxin. This later becomes generalized throughout the entire body. Through 2009 to 2017, there were a total of 264 cases and 19 deaths in the United States from tetanus. It doesn't sound like a lot, and that's because most of us have probably had our tetanus shot at one point in time. Anybody who works in fields where they're actually exposed or may come in contact with any kind of debris that could carry tetanus, so firefighters, construction workers, should all be up to date on their tetanus shots. If you haven't had a tetanus shot recently, I would suggest that maybe you talk to your PCP or your healthcare provider to see when your last booster was, especially if you're somebody who may come in contact with any kind of object that could give you tetanus. Now, as I mentioned, here in the U.S., the likelihood of death from tetanus is pretty low. We're pretty lucky. Worldwide, though, not so lucky. Although there has been a huge increase, I think an 85% increase in deaths since 1990 from tetanus. There's still around 35,000 deaths, or at least there were up around, I think the last data was from 2019, worldwide from tetanus. So it's still an issue, still something that can cause a lot of illness and even lead to death. All right, so there's one thing that can kind of harm us if you're wearing bare feet. How about something else? Something that a lot of us have probably dealt with at one point in time or another. How about fungus, right? There's a fungus among us. It might be on your feet. So, when it comes to fungus can cause toenail issues, it can give you plantar warts, obviously athlete's foot is very common, but it can also cause other kinds of skin problems. And this is a type of fungus too, if it's not treated, can actually spread, and it can actually cause systemic issues as well. Doesn't usually get to that point, but can be harmful. fungal diseases can also cause really serious illness and death. Beyond that, fungal infections themselves can be kind of costly. Per the CDC, direct medical costs from fungal infections are estimated to be anywhere from $11.5 billion to as high as $48 billion every year. There are also more than 75,000 hospitalizations and nearly 9 million outpatient visits every year just from fungal diseases. Now, granted, a lot of these probably aren't your athlete's foot where you can get tenactin for. At the same time, if you don't take care of it, it might become an issue. You end up having to go see your healthcare provider for it. What about deaths from fungus? So you can die from a fungal infection. There's an estimated 7,199 deaths from fungal diseases that occurred in 2021. Now, most minor fungal infections can be treated. There are antibiotics you can give for it. There are topical creams. Like I said, there's a lot of different treatments, over-the-counter stuff especially, for your ringworm, for your athlete's foot. But serious death, or serious illness and death, can still happen, especially if not treated and they turn to chronic conditions, and you can also have chronic recurrences as well. There are also new strains of fungus that are showing up that are becoming resistant to drugs. There's one this past year that's shown up more and more frequently. I think there have been 80 or so cases so far in the U.S., and it's extremely difficult to treat. We've had a couple of patients where I work that have had it. I know that one person did not make it, the other one did, but it takes an extremely long case of really dangerous antibiotics to actually kill the fungus when it gets to that point. So if bacteria that causes lockjaw and possible death and nasty fungal infections weren't enough, how about parasitic worms? So walking barefoot on contaminated soil can actually lead to hookworm infections. So you may ask, what is a hookworm? So hookworms are intestinal, blood-feeding, parasitic roundworms. They can be found all over the world, but are most common in areas with poor access to adequate water, sanitation, and hygiene. So conditions that a lot of you Minifans know pretty well. When walking barefoot, the actual larvae, the immature worms that are in the contaminated soil, can penetrate the skin. There's an estimated 740 million people in the world who are actually infected with hookworm. It was actually once widespread here in the U.S. too, particularly in the southeastern region of the United States. And hookworm infections are actually believed to be the cause of what's now a widespread stereotype that Southerners are slow and really lazy.
I like them French fried
In fact, in the early 20th century, there were doctors and public health officials who actually worked to destroy what they called the germ of laziness. Unbeknownst to them at the time that they were dealing with hookworm, but this was kind of their goal. They actually believed that the South's problems at that time of poverty and sickness and economic underdevelopment were caused by this germ, or hookworms. This might actually explain why Brandon Walker is the way he is too, I don't think it's inbreeding, but it could possibly be a parasitic worm, so Brandon may have the hookworm. Anyway, hookworms live in the small intestine. Their eggs are actually passed in the feces of infected people or animals. So if the infected person poops outside, the eggs go into the soil, and then they mature and hatch, releasing the larvae, these immature worms, which can actually infect anybody who's walking on it barefoot. What's interesting, these worms can actually just kind of penetrate through the skin of humans. So it's mainly acquired, obviously, by walking barefoot and on contaminated soil. Now, hopefully most of us aren't walking around on soil where somebody has pooped in the past, but you never know. Most people who get the hookworms, they have no symptoms. Some will have gastrointestinal symptoms, especially people who are infected for the first time. The most serious side effects of hookworm infection, though, are actually blood loss that leads to anemia. This can create complications which may need hospitalization. But thankfully, for just about everything else, there are medications to treat these parasites. But wouldn't it just be easier to put on a pair of shoes instead of walking barefoot? Just seems like a better option. So beyond pathogens, there are also physical side effects from walking barefoot, which can worsen or lead to conditions like misaligned feet. If you're someone who's ever had a running injury before, like a sprain or a stress fracture that hasn't healed properly, you increase the risk of re-injuring your foot or your leg again by walking barefoot, just because you don't have proper support for it. So lastly, and this applies to a large, and I do mean large, number of the Minifan family.
What's your name, fat
If you
body?
have diabetes, or if you're planning on getting diabetes, which it looks like a lot of you are, and you walk barefoot, you could actually be putting yourself at risk for wounds that may take a very long time to heal and can even lead to severe infections and eventual amputations if they're not properly taken care of. Diabetic neuropathy. This is nerve damage that's caused by diabetes. So with diabetes over time, if you have prolonged high blood glucose levels, they damage the small blood vessels throughout the body. There's a lot of these small vessels in your hands and in your feet, and damage to these vessels causes loss of nerve endings and creates a reduction in sensation. If you're walking barefoot, there's a good chance you won't even know that you have an injury until you become infected or it's painful. So to avoid this, if you have or are planning to get diabetes, you should never go barefoot. Remember to wear properly fitting footwear as well, and to check your feet just for any kinds of wounds. Like I said, this could honestly save you from getting your foot amputated. I've seen multiple occasions where you have patients who aren't compliant with their diabetes end up getting a foot injury. It starts out very small, but they don't take care of it. It gets infected, and it starts by losing toes, then part of the foot, then the whole foot, and then everything below the knee. So anybody who is a diabetic, take it seriously. It's something that you can manage pretty easily, and just take care of your feet. I talk a lot of shit here, but at the end of the day, I don't want people getting sick, and especially losing any kind of body parts. So enough about feet. So Kirk was probably right about bare feet, right? Not only is he disgusted by them, but just by being in bare feet can actually injure you or make you sick. So let's talk about Kirk's instinct to not go swimming in lakes or ponds. Kirk's kind of mentioned his avoidance of swimming in ponds and lakes. This is such a fun and harmless summer activity, right? No, maybe not quite. From a multitude of bacteria that can give you diarrhea, all the way to something as deadly as brain-eating amoebas, swimming in freshwater ponds and lakes can make you sick and even kill you. Per the CDC, from 2015 to 2019, there were 208 illness outbreaks that were related to outdoor activities. The most commonly reported illnesses were acute gastrointestinal illnesses, which would be diarrhea or vomiting, skin illnesses, such as rashes, and even acute respiratory illnesses, such as cough or congestion. So what exactly caused these outbreaks? Now, I'm going to give you the top 3 microorganisms. Number 1, Cryptosporidium. So Cryptosporidium causes cryptosporidosis. So this is currently the leading cause of United States waterborne disease outbreaks, and the third leading cause of United States zoonotic stomach illnesses, so illnesses passed from animals to humans. There's an estimated 823,000 cryptosporidosis cases that happen every year. These can cause frequent, non-bloody, watery diarrhea episodes. These typically last up to 2 to 3 weeks. It can also cause vomiting, nausea, abdominal pain, fever, loss of appetite, fatigue, and weight loss. For people who may be immunocompromised, it's even worse. They can actually get profuse watery diarrhea that can last weeks to months, and can even cause life-threatening malnutrition, resulting in hospitalization. So Cryptosporidium, number 1. How about number 2 if you want to take a dip in that pond or that lake? Well, number 2 is actually Legionella. So Legionella usually causes respiratory illness. It's an illness that's called Legionnaire's disease. The CDC reported nearly 10,000 cases of Legionnaire's disease in the U.S. back in 2018. And there was a recent study that estimated the true number of Legionnaire's disease cases could actually be a lot more. It's just people either didn't need medical attention for it or it was just underdiagnosed. What sucks about Legionnaire's disease is about 1 in 10 people who actually get sick from it will die. I've actually witnessed this firsthand. Legionella and Legionnaire's disease, once somebody has it and it becomes more of a pneumonia and enters the bloodstream, it's really, really hard to kill. It can be really deadly, really dangerous as well. The other problem with Legionella is that you can try and initially detect it through a urine test, but you have to send away the lab work, at least I know what my hospital does, and it can take days to get a positive result back to confirm that it's Legionnaire's. So while you may have suspicion that it's something else, you can't actually, you'd probably be given wide spectrum antibiotics anyway to help cover it, but you wouldn't have the specificity of the actual bacteria and the specific antibiotics needed to kill it. So diagnosis can take a little while, which also makes it just kind of a nasty, nasty bug. Anyway, so people get Legionnaire's disease when they breathe in small droplets of water or water particles that are in the air and that can kind of enter the lung. It usually occurs in freshwater environments, just naturally, lakes, streams, ponds, but it can also be found in HVAC systems too. And this was actually the what caused the first Legionella outbreak before anybody had really discovered it or known about it. This took place in Philadelphia back in 1976 at a Legionnaire's convention, hence the name Legionella. It's actually where it came from. It was an unknown bacteria at the time, so after that first outbreak, they wound up calling it Legionnaire's disease because it happened at a Legionnaire's convention. Anyway, that's Legionella. Then there's Cullinane's old friend. This is number 3 on the list, norovirus. Most norovirus outbreaks here in the U.S., they happen from November to April, right? Not prime outdoor swimming. But it still remains the third leading cause of illness for outdoor recreational activities each year. Per the CDC, there are 900 deaths every year related to norovirus. There are 109,000 hospitalizations from it, 465,000 emergency department visits, and over 2 million outpatient clinic visits just from norovirus. There's an estimated 19 to 21 million illnesses too. A lot of these don't need to go to the hospital, don't need to go to a clinic. They just resolve on themselves or by themselves, like the Cullinane family witnessed firsthand. But norovirus is really nasty, really contagious. Even people who don't go to the hospital, you still get to enjoy like 24 to 48 hours of puking, diarrhea, stomach cramps. So, if you want to take a dip in your local pond, just think about the consequences afterwards. Now, diarrhea, vomiting, the possibility of a respiratory illness that could land you in the hospital, all reasons to avoid freshwater swimming, right? But what about the possibility of ingesting a brain-eating amoeba? So you may have heard stories in the news. Every year there are always a few of these. It's not incredibly common. It's fairly rare, fairly random. But brain-eating amoebas, which were actually first discovered in Australia in 1965, otherwise known as, these are called Naegleria fowleri. They live in soil. They live in warm, freshwater lakes, rivers, and hot springs. So they call it the brain-eating amoeba because this amoeba actually enters through the nose when water is inhaled or forced up through the nasal passages. This often happens if you've ever jumped in the water and you get that kind of fizzy feeling in the nose. That's kind of water going up into your nasal cavity, up into your nose. So these amoebas get in there, and the brain-eating amoeba is actually able to migrate up closer into the brain.
Check out the big brain on bread.
The amoeba's effect on the brain, once it gets up into the nose, it starts a reaction that causes inflammation of that brain tissue. This inflammation, obviously there's nothing there to destroy the amoeba. The amoeba ends up causing more and more damage to tissue. The tissue becomes more and more inflamed. More swelling happens. You get increased swelling of the brain, and this leads to severe neurological complications, and then in almost 100% of the cases, death. Like I said, thankfully there are only a few of these every year, but the number of cases and the bodies of water they've been found in are actually increasing. As I said before, these are typically found in warm freshwater climates, but there have been recent cases in Indiana, in Iowa, and even a couple in Minnesota. So even for us living in northern climates now, we really have to kind of consider the fact that you may get a brain-eating amoeba the next time you jump into a pond. And like I said, these are almost always 100% fatal. There was a case, though, of a kid who got one last year in Florida, I think, and he actually survived, which is pretty crazy. You can find the story online, but does not usually happen. So it looks like Kirk was right about swimming in waters, too. At least fresh lakes, ponds, all that stuff. Probably stick to the swimming pool, I guess. But then you got to worry about other things, like people peeing in the pool, all that fun stuff. Interesting fact, that wonderful smell of a pool that you get, that kind of fresh, people think it's chlorine. The chlorine that's put into pools is typically, you can't smell it, it's odorless. It's only when it reacts with urea, which is found in urine, and sweat, that you get that smell, that classic kind of chlorine pool smell. So the next time you enter, a nice pool and you think, oh, nice, fresh, clean pool, smells like chlorine. The only reason that it smells like that is that it's reacting with like urea. So, like I said, it's a byproduct of urine or sweat. So it may not just be urine, it may just be sweat because people, even though they don't feel it, you still sweat when you're in a pool. So that'll pretty much do it for today. Before I do end the episode, though, I kind of want to Ryan Whitney on an episode of the Kirk Minahan Show. It'll be almost a week now, I think, when this actually is published. Was talking about using nicotine pouches instead of actually using either dip or something else, just because he felt that it was safer. So I did a little research for you, Ryan. So the nicotine pouches, they're actually safe. They are safer for you when it comes to risks for cancer, as opposed to smokeless tobacco or dip or even smoking. The problem is there hasn't been a lot of research done to see if these have long-term consequences. There was one study that found that there are toxicant levels. There were 26 harmful and potentially harmful constituents from some of these products. I don't know what brand you use. These were snus products. But as of right now, it's a safer alternative for you. I don't know if I'd recommend, obviously, and remember, people, no matter what I say on the show, this isn't medical advice. Anything I tell you should always check with your healthcare provider before, either seeking medical treatment or if you're going to seek medical treatment or starting any kind of medical treatment. But from the research I did, it looks like you're better off doing this stuff. There is nicotine. Nicotine's still highly addictive. As you stated on the show, it's like you can't go more than 5 minutes without throwing one of those in your mouth. So just based on that, the frequency that you're actually using it, even though the nicotine itself may not be harmful, a lot of the byproducts that are in that could be harmful. Right now, really the only side effects you're seeing from it are upset stomach. I think there's some gastrointestinal stuff, some gastrointestinal issues, and then kind of sores in the mouth. And then people get hiccups from it too. I don't know if that's something that bothers you or not. But this is one of those things, those pouches, they're not FDA regulated. So even like nicotine gum is regulated by the FDA. They've done studies on it, done tests on it. This stuff the FDA hasn't done any kind of tests on. There have been applications, though, that have been made to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration for approval of these nicotine pouches. And there's one brand called Verve that has received a pre-market approval. So I think the FDA has kind of looked at that. But like I said, these are relatively new products, and there just needs to be more research done, and we have no idea long-term if there could be effects from it. But you don't want oral cancer of any kind. So if you can, slowly wean yourself off this stuff and avoid that, it'd probably be awesome. But anyway, that is the episode for this week. As always, I love to get feedback from people. Make Me Sick Pod on Twitter. You can email me at youmakemesickpod@gmail.com. Always looking for recommendations, feedback. If anybody, I've had a few people reach out. I'm probably going to do a couple of collaborations that I know of. So, and it doesn't have to be just about microorganisms. I know it's super boring, so a lot of people kind of probably doze off listening to this. If somebody's got a story just about, everybody's got a story, right? So if you've got a story about, maybe a medical condition you had, somebody in your family, something that might be interesting, that's weird or rare, or, you just want to tell your story, that stuff interests me. I nerd out on, on medical stuff. So anyway, that'll do it for this week. Please reach out if you have any suggestions or feedback. And remember, people, always wash your hands.
Hell, I like you. You can come over to my house and fuck my sister.
It's a bowel movement.
I got a fever.